Barry Scheck came to the world's attention as one of O.J. Simpson's most aggressive lawyers. Scheck and his partner Peter Neufeld were brought onto the case to undermine the prosecutor's DNA evidence. Why was O.J. acquitted? Was race a factor? What was the relationship between members of the so-called Dream Team? Joining me now are the co-directors of the Innocence Project at Cardozo School of Law and Simpson lawyers Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld. And I'm pleased to have them there. Welcome. What led you to the Simpson case? How did that come about? Peter?
Bob Shapiro called us. Seriously, that's about it. We got a call from Shapiro about 2 weeks after June 12th. We were actually working on another case at the time, an unjust conviction case, on behalf of somebody who we did get out, who had spent 12 years in prison for rapes he didn't commit. And we were working on that matter. We were in the middle of some hearings, and Bob called and wanted help. He was about to begin the preliminary hearings on the Simpson matter and needed some help with how to deal with the blood evidence, and he asked us for our assistance, and we started calling him. He started calling us from his car phone in the car on the way to court. Yeah. We were feeding him questions for court that day, and then shortly after that he asked us to come on board. And initially we only thought we were going to be involved in a hearing on the admissibility of the DNA evidence, you know, a 2 or 3 week hearing. That would be the end of it. Well, what happened is the hearing, as you may recall, got scrapped, and next thing we knew, we were involved in a 9-month trial. Barry was there for the full 9 months. I had to try a murder case in New York.
Which became a controversy unto itself.
Which became another sideshow. That's right. So I tried that case, and then after I won that case, I joined Barry back out in California. And you were there since, what, November?
On and off since November.
I mean, I was there since February, in February.
Tell me the ups and downs of doing this. Are you glad you got involved?
Boy, is that a tough question. It was a very, very painful process. I mean, you know, just from a personal point of view, you know, we both are married to wonderful, understanding women who have careers of their own, and we have children, and it was not easy on anybody. So from that point of view, this just wasn't a lot of fun. And it was really an extraordinarily surreal experience in terms of the way the criminal justice system functions in Los Angeles, the role of cameras in the courtroom, the media coverage of this. It was very, very difficult to try the case, which was an extraordinarily complex case, and try to get to some of the truth here, which a lot of people didn't want to hear.
What was the truth they didn't want to hear?
Well, there was a very, very serious police misconduct in this case, led by a cop that was a genocidal racist who I think other police officers knew was a very bad guy, who the prosecutors should have known because they were given information by people in their own office that indicated he was exactly that kind of person. And I think we've demonstrated, although a lot of people don't seem to want to hear it, but the jury understood it, is that they tampered with evidence. They tampered with the sock that had EDTA on it, that had wet transfer to the third surface, which you can't get if a leg is in it. They tampered with the items from the back gate.
There's no question in your mind that they tampered with the evidence, that they did the things that...
I think we proved it.
You know, people talk about that all the time, and I think that's sort of like water under the bridge at this point. Yeah. But there's a more compelling point that Barry was alluding to, which is that, I mean, the prosecutors, I mean, police officers may have tampered with evidence, the prosecutors tampered with that jury. One of the reasons that the jury, I think, was so quick to return a verdict of not guilty in this case is that they felt betrayed by the prosecutors. You had prosecutors who, it's not a question of should have known about Mark Fuhrman. They did know about Mark Fuhrman. They knew he was a racist. They knew he was a liar. They knew that Van Atta was a liar. They knew that they had
Van Atta a liar about what motivated him to go over.
Of course, it was obvious. It's obvious to everybody. It's obvious to anybody who works in the criminal justice system what motivated them to go over that wall that night. It had absolutely nothing to do with notifications.
Well, not only that, take Judge Ito, who certainly was not making rulings in favor of the defense from the beginning to the end of the trial. He made a finding that Van Atta displayed a reckless disregard for the truth, which in legalese means he lied, in obtaining a search warrant from the judge at the very beginning of the case. And I defy anybody to tell me why this man was walking around with an unsealed reference sample from O.J. Simpson, Mr. Simpson's blood, for 3 hours and didn't book it and brought it to the crime scene.
Do you believe
and the blood is missing.
that do you believe that he is the one who took that blood evidence and somehow used it at the premises to?
You can't say, because we don't have a videotape of Van Atta doing something like that. But look, you have Paratus, the nurse, who says under oath, back in June of '94, I drew 8 cc's of blood. I'm absolutely sure of it. How am I sure of it? Because the syringe has calibrations on it. I looked at the numbers on it. They don't like that evidence because we were able to point out that there was 1.5 cc's of blood missing. So what do? And that's part of the cover-up and part of the, you know, the guile, if you will, of the prosecutors. 12 months later, they get this same nurse alone in his house without any defense attorney present, without him being sworn under oath, and have him say, oh, I recant the whole thing.
Right.
It never happened. I didn't look at the calibrations on the syringe. When I said 8 cc's, I was wrong. The jury looks at that and says, these people are trying to pull the wool over our eyes. No one's going to accept this. And what I'm telling you is this, is jurors can forgive somebody who commits a crime. Jurors can forgive someone who makes a mistake. Jurors cannot forgive a cover-up. And they saw the prosecutors participating in that cover-up.
In your judgment, do you believe that the jurors in this case believe he committed a crime but could not tolerate what you think is a cover-up?
No, I think the jurors all concluded that that O.J. Simpson had not committed that crime.
Is that your conclusion, Peter?
About the jury?
No, about O.J. Simpson, that he did not commit the crime, that he did not kill those 2 people.
Oh, I'm certainly convinced. I mean, one thing you have to appreciate is that both Barry and I had the opportunity to meet Mr. Simpson 9 months ago, a year ago, and I've gotten to know him quite well. And I mean, you know, I've rarely had a client who was adamant about his innocence, as sincere about his innocence, and as persuasive about his innocence. And
what's persuasive about it? Because there's so many people that even after this verdict believe that this jury reached this decision because of all the things that you pointed out with respect to contamination, terrible police work, and a genocidal racist, you know, the characterization of Furman.
Well, first, I think that one of the things that was very persuasive about Mr. Simpson's innocence is that he was always personally very persuasive. Then, as time went on, you know, this blood evidence started to come in, which didn't look too good. And all of a sudden, you know, he would say, well, I don't know what to tell you, but it's not true. And things began to happen. How do you account for the fact that when the prosecutors went out and tried to test the blood on the sock, which I think everybody recognized was flaky to begin with, and the blood on the back gate, which they didn't find till July 3rd and didn't have pictures of, that all of a sudden it comes back with EDTA? Which is a preservative from a blood tube. That is extraordinary. And then, you know, the contention was that Furman had planted the glove, and that Furman was lying about so many of these activities and had very good reasons to want to, you know, implicate Mr. Simpson because of his racial animus, and that was our contention. And then all of a sudden, you find the Furman tapes, which is the most extraordinary documentation of this one can imagine. And one of the things that Peter brought out at the end of the case that everybody loses sight of is that we were able to demonstrate that Furman was pointing at the glove at Bundy at 4:30 in the morning at night in that picture when he swore and all these other cops swore that it happened at 7:10. So why is he pointing to this picture, this glove, at 4:30 in the morning?
You should point out, Barry, just to remind them that the significance of that is that that's a half hour before he ever went over to Mr. Simpson's home.
Right.
All right. But
I mean, and people just forget about all this. It's extraordinary. You have to understand something, that this jury watched the prosecution's principal witnesses be taken apart, you know, step by step, be demonstrated as complete liars, saw that the evidence was tampered with. Now, you ask, were all the jurors convinced of his innocence?
that he did not do it.
That he did not do it. I'm sure many were. I'm sure that for others in the jury, they probably suspected, well, maybe he committed this crime, but we have to have reasonable doubts, many reasonable doubts in a circumstantial case. And I submit that if people are fair-minded about their evaluation of the evidence, and frankly stop listening to the sound bites and the commentators that were telling them what the evidence was, as opposed to really evaluating the evidence as it unfolded in the trial.
But just hold one second for both of you, though. 1 second. It seems to me that with all that evidence there, it helped you form your conclusion about whether he did it. But you both say it was he is the person that convinced you he didn't do it, in terms of you looked at him in the eye and you know he wouldn't lie to you.
Well, he's just...
Well, didn't you say that? I mean, I think I heard...
Sure, well, sure, but it's... No, actually, I think you were quoting, I think Mr. Shapiro said
No,
that
but I
on
thought I
Larry
heard
King.
you say that
Well,
to Tom Brokaw, in fact.
I think everybody
I'm just trying to
takes that
understand,
view.
which nobody here, they've seen the presentation of the evidence, but they haven't been with O.J. Simpson and have no appreciation of what he is saying and what it is about him, you know, and his explanation of where he was and what he did that is so convincing to you that was not, say, convincing to a number of people who felt like he did these crimes.
Charlie, just so we don't get, we don't lead ourselves down the wrong road here, we're not at liberty to disclose the kind of confidential or privileged communications that we had with O.J.
But there was
sorry
something about that process that made you say, this is worth fighting for, not only because of police misconduct, because this is a wronged man, this is a man who did not commit these crimes. Because I assume it would have been a tough call for you if you believed otherwise.
Well, sure, but...
Because of the nature of your work, in fact, you know.
But I think that if you just look at the evidence itself, you know, put aside, even for a second, what was plainly police misconduct and we think tampering with the evidence, you know, the basic timeline here is extraordinary. I mean, and the jury on that alone had a right to acquit him, because in a circumstantial evidence case, if they can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt he had an opportunity to commit the crime, you must acquit. And the truth of the matter is that all these independent citizen witnesses came forward to the police and told them at what time they heard dogs barking and voices at the crime scene, and they threw him out of the office and they never called him to the witness stand. And all of that demonstrates, when you put it together with Alan Park's testimony and every other reasonable inference about what happened, that the timing is impossible, the trace evidence is impossible, the prosecution's theory about exactly how this all happened is not sensible. There's a lot of reasonable doubt.
Let me ask you a naive question then. Why is it not so obvious to Marcia Clark and Chris Darden, who seem to me to be two honorable people as well?
Well, there's two things. I mean, first of all, for Marcia Clark and Chris Darden, they're advocates. They're working for the district attorney's office. And, you know, this notion that we represent the people of the state of California is a lot of hooey.
I don't think Chris Darden, he doesn't appear to me to be the kind of person on television that would be engaged in this prosecution if he had a huge problem.
Charlie, you've worked on television long enough to know there may be a vast difference between the public persona and the private persona, okay?
I take your point about Mr. Darden.
All right. Look, there's something you really have to think about here. Rather than focusing on the evidence, let's think about the process. Why is it that 12 people, by the way, 3 of whom are non-African American, without any significant deliberations, immediately voted not guilty? All right? Why is it that happens, in spite of the fact...
Let's examine that. One, they'd already made up their mind because they've been sitting there for a long time.
Just one second. Yeah, but they've been sitting there listening to the evidence for 9 months.
Right.
All right? And they heard a lot of the same evidence as everybody else heard. What's the difference? One difference is the way you heard it, it was filtered through the pundits and commentators who put their own spin on it at the end of each day. And you can't begin to guess the number of times that Barry and I would sit there in court, we'd hear the testimony, we'd think, wow, we really were able to effectively undermine the legitimacy of that witness. It ended up being a very pro-defense day. You go home and you listen to the spin on the evening news, and it was like a completely different trial.
Oh, I can give you a great example.
Different trial.
A great example. When I was cross-examining Dennis Fung, it was actually on re-cross-examination that Fung said that 3 of the 4 bloodstains that were found, that Furman claimed to have seen on the door sill of the Bronco, could not be seen unless the door was open. And I asked that question and, you know, put it forward to the jury in a way that I think was absolutely plain to them that this meant Furman was in that car, despite his protestations to the contrary. At the preliminary hearing, he had these 2 Freudian slips. One, he talked about seeing both of them referring to the gloves, and secondly, he said he found blood in the Bronco. So if you can't see the 4 bloodstains when the door is closed, and you can see 3 of them only when the door is open, that is an extraordinary piece of evidence. The commentators that day were only interested in the fact that when I was asking these questions on recross-examination, I wasn't as animated as I had been on other occasions when we caught Fung making, telling fibs or lies on videotape, where you could say, where is it, Mr. Fung? So if you're not jumping up and down, or one day the judge yells at you or something like that, that's the story of the day, and they missed the substantive evidence. And we saw that happening again and again and again, but it wasn't lost on the jury.
That's the first problem, okay? The second problem, which this whole process raises, is why is it that most white people can't believe that evidence was planted in this case, and believe, therefore, he must be guilty based on the forensic
Let me just tell you what,
evidence.
without, and again, I haven't been doing
I'm not talking about you,
okay, but I know you're not.
I'm talking about most white people.
And let me tell you, I'm starting to say I haven't been watching this every night and following and doing a show about it every night, so I'm not as up as a lot of other people who did it. However, I think the perception is that a lot of people believe that, that notwithstanding the contamination and whatever took place, and which might have been a big reason to create reasonable doubt, that Mr. Simpson still committed the crimes.
Now, most people, people can can accept that the Los Angeles Police Department Crime Laboratory may be a cesspool of contamination, but they don't believe that uniformed police officers or detectives would actually go out of their way and intentionally plant incriminating evidence. They don't accept that. It's so foreign to their experience, to their consciousness, that they just don't accept it. And here's the problem. You had in the Rodney King video, if Rodney King had gone to the police and said, or to the U.S. Attorney and said, I was beaten viciously by these 4 police officers for no reason, no one believed him. He presents a videotape. Now they believe him. But does it change the way the LAPD did business after that? No, it didn't. In Johnny Cochran's opening statement, and early on in this case, we said that Mark Fuhrman is a genocidal racist and he could have planted evidence in this case, and no one believed him. Then they get Mark Fuhrman on audio tape saying, I am a genocidal racist and I do plant evidence whenever I see a white woman in the company of an African-American male. Full admission. Then they say, yep, Mark Fuhrman had done it in the past. And that's how most white people responded. He's a vicious, terrible human being. He probably did that in the past. That doesn't mean he did it in this case. It takes so much for people to accept that police officers routinely can do this kind of thing in African-American communities throughout America. It's shocking. That kind of disparity in consciousness and experience is so upsetting.
So the LA Police Department, in at least 2 examples, set out to contaminate evidence and set out to make sure that O.J. Simpson was convicted. No, let me finish the question. Was convicted of these 2 crimes. That's the point you're making.
No, you have to understand how the evolution.
But isn't that what Peter was saying? That's what I heard him say.
Yes, but the evolution of it is
there was a conspiracy.
You're oversimplifying. I mean, in this respect. No. I mean, there's no question they planted evidence, but what you seem to be saying, you seem to be losing track of one thing. When Mark Fuhrman responded to the scene of this crime,
right,
he had already been to Mr. Simpson's residence, where he didn't arrest him in an incident where a car was bashed. And, it is safe to say, because he himself said that that incident was indelibly etched in his mind, that when he arrived upon that scene and saw Nicole Brown Simpson dead, that he formed a belief and a very strong opinion about who did this, as did all the other officers there. And they did rush to judgment, and they did focus on him exclusively.
Rush to judgment is one thing, Barry, as you know. It is another thing to set out to go ahead.
Let me just finish for a second. And maybe this will be a little easier for you. So you rush to judgment, you stop all investigation, all 4 of those police officers are focused on O.J. Simpson as a suspect. They let the crime scene go stale. They don't look for anybody else. It's the most important time in a murder investigation to go look for other people, to canvass, to do all the things you should do. They go to Rockingham. I would bet that most people, including yourself, didn't believe for a second that whole story about, we went there to save lives.
You're right.
He was the suspect.
Right.
They went over the wall. Does it really is it really so hard for you to believe that he would throw the glove down there in an effort to get a search warrant, which they lied to get in the first place, that they went into the car, that they began focusing on him when they heard that he was out of town, that they began focusing the investigation? And one thing you have to understand, police will go after somebody, as Fuhrman said himself in the tapes. When we find a bad guy, we start you know, trying a way to make a case. And all of a sudden, you get locked in to that, and you have to start improving the evidence. He flies back from Chicago the next morning. They immediately handcuff him. They are involved in this. They are, you know, all of a sudden, there's no way out.
All right, so the answer is they got so sucked into it and they were involved because they'd done some contamination. But is it impossible for you, and I'm trying to argue the case, I'm just trying to reflect, because of your experiences, the questions that I think are still on the public's mind. Is it so hard for you to believe that you could have two rotten apples, one or more, and Furman and you say Van Atter, that, wait, well, listen to me, Barry, 1 second. Oh, of course you did. You did prove it. And clearly the jury accepted it, and that's why O.J. Simpson is free this evening. But is it possible that these two cops, and certainly Furman, could do that kind of thing, and yet at the same time there was other evidence that linked dramatically O.J. Simpson to these crimes?
Like what?
That this could have happened?
Like what?
Like what?
What's left? I mean,
So if you're talking about the sock, the back gate, and the glove,
and the Bundy blood drops.
And the Bundy drops, which may have been the result of cross-contamination and sloppy handling by the police department, whether evidence is there. The timeline is much more consistent with innocence than guilt. The demeanor evidence of Mr. Simpson before the time and after the incident is much more consistent with innocence than guilt. The man has no prior substantial criminal history at all. You wouldn't expect him to do something like this. Even the so-called domestic violence issue, there's a single incident of physical violence in 1989. Both of us have years of experience working, representing battered women who killed their abusers. We've each done a half a dozen or more cases in this area over the last decade. We're very familiar with the bomb, among others. We're very familiar with the with the research, and I'm telling you, I've never seen a case where there was a killing, where there wasn't an escalation of violence, building up, finally to the time when someone gets murdered. Here you have a single incident in 1989 and nothing in terms of a physical assault for 5 years. It doesn't make sense. So all that non-forensic evidence points towards innocence, not toward guilt. Which brings me back to the I think, which is the follow-up question, which you have to ask yourself when I started talking about the Rodney King videotape and then the Furman audio tape. The saddest thing is that Furman probably will never be indicted. Tomorrow, why would he never be indicted? Why would he never be indicted? Isn't there perjury on his face? Yeah, and tomorrow it will be business as usual at the Los Angeles Police Department. There will not be any meaningful changes, and most people Williams has no capacity as
he's under attack
for not.
No, he's under attack.
He's an attack from his own officers.
Yeah, I mean, he's been undermined from the beginning. I think one of the most extraordinary aspects of this is that in Furman's own statement to the psychiatrist, 10 years ago, which remarkably we couldn't put into evidence in the first place.
This is when he was trying to get out and get his pension.
Right, and he admitted all his hatreds. He actually talks about that Hollenbach incident, that chilling incident where they beat up all those people and they sprayed the blood off their uniform. He talks about that incident. The incident where he went before Internal Affairs and they beat the case.
And they don't
What is he doing there in that police force? How could that go on?
And by the way, to Williams' credit, I don't think Williams alone could ever change it anyway, even if he was the greatest commissioner in the world. I think these kinds of changes.
Because, I've interviewed him a number of times. He does not strike me as someone who would tolerate this if he could do something about it.
But you and I know that kind of meaningful change can take a decade or more to bring about that kind of transformation.
But are you saying every police officer investigating this case, not just Furman and not just Van Atten, somehow was caught up in some kind of conspiracy?
No. But one of the worst things is,
Barry, you look at me when I say that. This is the part that's being made time and time again. That for all the things that seem to suggest took place in order to point the finger at guilt had to be taken place with the consent and knowledge of each other, which is a conspiracy.
Well, I have two real problems. I have two real problems with your question. The first one is that it's too glib when you say, and it's what the prosecutors were saying and what the jury rejected, and that is that everybody would have to be involved. It didn't take everybody. It would take really just two bad cops and a number of people.
Well, would it take Mark Furman and Van Atten cooperating together with knowledge of what each were doing? Would it take that?
I think that was part of it. I think that was demonstrated. Look, you can't ask us to tell you exactly how it happened, because what we were able to prove is that by the objective scientific evidence, something was terribly wrong here. Now, So that's point number one. It really didn't take that many people, and we demonstrated that at every turn, people were covering up, turning the other way, and not investigating things at all. Number two, and this is really a problem that I really think you ought to come to terms with, because you're sitting here pressing us saying, well, do you believe he's innocent? We've told you we do.
Right.
But
And
the problem here
Yeah.
in America is,
Right.
I say to you, Charlie Rose, if you were sitting on that jury after hearing all this evidence,
Right.
if you were fair-minded about it, you may even walk away saying, I still have suspicions, but you would have to vote not guilty. And that's not a bad thing. It's a test of citizenship.
I
It is
agree.
a test of citizenship. And right now we're embattled with arguments in this country that is tearing us apart in terms of racism and all other kinds of issues about our criminal justice system and whether it works and it doesn't work and whether these stats are reasonable, because people don't accept that. At the very least, you have to accept that this jury had a lot of very, very good reasons to say, we can't abide it. We cannot abide it. You can't come in here and lie to us like this.
But nothing I have asked you,
nothing
that I have asked you suggests otherwise, that you don't accept that fact. I mean, it seems to me, the preface of what my interest and curiosity is, we haven't heard from two people who were very much involved in this. And we have watched Johnny Cochran and Shapiro, and I assume Bailey somewhere that I haven't seen. But here you two guys coming from New York, going out there, being involved, having the richness of the experience that you have in terms of evidentiary issues. To ask you, tell me what you knew, because you've had contact, is not to make a statement about the guilt of innocence of O.J. Simpson, but to ask questions that are on people's minds.
Charlie.
So you shouldn't, in a sense,
Charlie, just to
look at me and say, how dare you ask that question?
No. Well,
Charlie, just to follow up, wait a second.
Well, I mean, I will say it to you. I will say to you, I think that if you look at this tape again later, okay? And you started off by saying, do you believe he's innocent?
Right.
And we said yes,
right.
Okay? And then we told you, well, you know, there's certain limits as to how much we can talk about it, because it's privileged, and this man enjoys that privilege. And then we went on to talk a little bit about the evidence, and you seem willing to concede that the jury had a basis for its verdict, and all the tampering with the evidence. But yet you're deep down, what you really want to say is, prove him innocent to me. Come back in here with, you know, the 2 or 3 people that committed this.
No,
wait,
Peter, wait 1 second. No, Barry. Deep down, I want this audience to really understand what you are saying. I want you to give me an opportunity to ask you. I ask you a simple question. Was it just Van Adder and Furman, or was it more?
Charlie.
I mean, that's not a glib question. That is a direct, precise question.
Fair enough.
Do you, who had such an impact on this trial, as Peter did, believe it was more than these 2 people? And do you believe they worked together? You haven't said that. I'd like to know.
Charlie,
That's not a value judgment on my part,
Barry,
right? You give me that?
Sure.
What Barry was alluding to, all right, is aside from corruption of the evidence or contamination of the evidence, is this whole notion not of conspiracy, but of cover-up. The biggest problem you have with a law enforcement agency like the Los Angeles Police Department, and by the way, they're not unique in this regard. It happens here in New York City.
Lawyers, doctors, others do this too.
It's called, you know, the blue wall.
But you cover up each other and protect your butts.
And it's that code of silence.
Institutional code of silence.
And the problem here is that there was a whole slew of people who all of a sudden had selective memories, closed their eyes at convenient times. Remember Mazzola? I closed my eyes at the one moment that the vial was supposedly passed. Paratus, who clearly was not a person who planted evidence, but all of a sudden recants 12 months later and says, I was wrong when I said I drew 8 cc's of blood. I had the vial turned over upside down, so I couldn't see the numbers on it. One after another, different police officers who participated in this, or different members of the Los Angeles Police Department Scientific Investigation Division, all of a sudden start covering up for other members of the department. And that is what makes it so easy for 1 or 2 bad apples to do their dirty work. And that's what happened here. And we are able to...
It's not unlike police corruption in the NYPD, is that people close ranks, and even though they saw something, they don't talk.
The code of silence is a key aspect of this. But there's another thing that goes right to the forensic science of it, and that is everybody recognized that it was an extraordinarily sloppy laboratory, and that they didn't do the little things in terms of documenting the chain of custody of the evidence that you would expect from people that were going to do a competent job. And that's very important, because that kind of sloppiness invites and permits tampering. I mean, a very little thing. If you really do
basic.
count the swatches
Right.
and you really do initial the bindles, it gets a little harder to do something wrong. But if you have a mode of operation, which they do there, where the police have suzerainty over the crime lab, and they're not independent, you know, forensic scientists, this kind of thing can happen.
All right. I've got to ask these questions, Barry, without you or Peter, with either of you thinking that I am trying to retry O.J. Simpson. I'm trying to raise some curiosity and points that are unanswered. Have you seen any evidence that would indicate other people did it? And what is compelling about what's come in? Because you've offered this reward, you've had this 800 number, and all these things that have been out there. People have offered rewards. Why has there no indication come forward so far to implicate someone else?
Well, I mean, you know, someone asked me yesterday, said, well, if it wasn't O.J. Simpson, then who?
Right.
And I said, well, it was one or more of the other 4 billion people on the planet. We cannot be expected. That's, I mean, it's not our job.
It's not you, but I'm just asking, have you seen any evidence?
Well, no, but one of
else?
the reasons we haven't seen it is because the Los Angeles Police Department didn't do their job. They never pursued any other leads.
Right.
They never looked in the places they should be looking. They didn't do those things. For instance, you have a whole series.
They didn't do that because they thought that all the evidence pointed this way, and therefore they followed
They made a
up the evidence
decision
that
about
way.
O.J. Simpson within an hour and a half after they arrived at Bundy, and that was it. They stopped looking.
They sat around, they did nothing, and then they went to his house.
For instance, there's a whole number of fingerprints that were lifted at the crime scene that are not consistent with Mr. Simpson and are not consistent with any member of the family or any of the police officers or any of the neighbors. In the area right near the body or right near the gate, you know, the rear gate, which the assailant or assailants fled from, they've never identified those fingerprints. They've never tried to identify those fingerprints. In fact, it was the defense who said, why don't you at least run them through the FBI's computer system to see whether or not there's somebody out there.
And why wouldn't they do it? Because they said, we've got our man and that's it?
Well, they stopped looking. That's the whole point.
There's blood under her nails that were inconsistent with anybody else, that, you know, demonstrates that another person was involved. But I think that there are leads. You know, one thing that is a misconception here, they had, I think, altogether something like 47 prosecutors, the FBI, Interpol, the Department of Justice Laboratory in California, Cellmark. They had a huge, huge investigatory force arrayed against the defense in this case, which, frankly, brought more resources to the table than one ordinarily finds, but not nearly as much. I mean, we're sitting there really with just one and then later 2 full-time investigators for the bulk of the trial, and it's enough really for them to be investigating the prosecution's case is what we had to do. There were some leads, and there are still some leads that people will be pursuing you know, because we got thousands of calls.
Do you think this is a killing done by more than one person?
Yeah.
You do? You're convinced in your mind?
I think that the forensic evidence suggests that it was more than one person
that did it.
Yeah.
But what's extraordinary here is, and Barry was talking about it, is you had the largest law enforcement array that I have ever seen in a case, and it's just a single defendant. We're not talking about, I mean, there was more law enforcement investigating a single defendant homicide than investigated the World Trade Center, you know, bombing conspiracy case. That's incredible when you think about it. Yet, they were never, the FBI, the Justice Department, Interpol, the New York City Police Department, the Chicago Police Department, never looked at other leads or any other people. All of that manpower was directed at one person only.
3 different questions. One, why was O.J. Simpson in that Bronco with that gun, with that money, with that passport on that highway, number 1? Number 2, why did he write the letter that he did? And 3, why didn't the prosecution offer that as evidence of something, a frame of mind or something?
Why do you think?
I don't know.
If it helped them, would they have done it?
Of course they would.
Well,
so,
I think that...
and they didn't. And why was that? And if Johnny Cochran... Go ahead.
Well, I mean, this is a part of the case that we're a little less familiar with because we came in after all that happened. And we've, heard bits and pieces of it from people that were there that are very persuasive about it, Barb Kardashian and others.
And what did they say?
Well, I think that the overall judgment of both the defense and the prosecution is that they put it on. Most people would wind up feeling pretty sympathetic towards Mr. Simpson and believing that his thoughts were suicide and that it wasn't consciousness of guilt or flight. I mean, where was he going? And a lot of misinformation was put out about that in terms of money and the suitcase and a lot of other things. But overall, it plainly wasn't going to help them. And if it were, they would have put it on without hesitation.
Suggesting that perhaps he was going to go to her gravesite and shoot himself.
It's the same reason why they didn't...
done out of love for her would be the logical extension of that?
Yeah. I'm not a psychiatrist.
No, but you, come on.
No, but it's also the same reason why the prosecution chose not to put in the statement that Mr. Simpson gave voluntarily.
Why didn't they do that?
Well, for the same reason. I mean, here you have a guy who comes right back from Chicago, goes and sees the police. He says, no, I don't need a lawyer. I'm going to go in there alone and meet with the police and have them question me. Talks to them freely for a half hour or more, makes a full statement, consents to have his blood taken, to have himself examined, physically and photographed, all of that. All of that is consistent with innocence, not consistent with guilt. And even though people try to analyze that statement of his and suggest, ooh, this is false exculpatory remarks by Mr. Simpson, okay, if in fact the prosecution saw it the same way that those pundits did, they would have introduced that statement, but they didn't.
Because it stood up.
Yeah.
Right.
What do you think this, and both of you, this trial under this scrutiny did for the administration of justice in America? A positive or a negative thing?
Well, it remains to be seen. If people take away from this case some lessons about the police and about crime labs that really ought to be reckoned with, then maybe some good will come out of this. If we learn something more about race and the criminal justice system and the way we perceive things as a country, and something good comes of this discussion, then maybe there'll be some positives. In terms of the way this case was covered by the media and respect for the dignity of the courts and the process, I think we've got some serious trouble.
I think one of the most important lessons for the criminal justice system is what it says about race. It's interesting, I don't think it's a coincidence, that just yesterday they reported that I think a third of all young black men at this time, are having contact with the criminal justice system.
33%.
Yeah,
33%.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. It's a horrible, horrible thought. And is that a coincidence? No, of course it's not a coincidence. And it's, I think, inextricably linked to the inability of most white people to appreciate that police officers in uniform will single out black people for beatings, will single out black people for being framed, and will single out black people for beating confessions out of them or anything else. And I think we as a race have to look inside and try and figure out what kind of criminal justice system have we created where a third of all young blacks are tied up in the criminal justice system. And if you connect that to what we saw in the Rodney King tape, to what we see in the Furman audio tapes, then you begin to answer those questions. And until we really answer those questions in a meaningful way, there will be no change.
And you have to look at class and money. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things people say is that, O.J. Simpson, bought justice or bought his verdict because he was actually able to bring some resources to the table and investigate the police and find the Furman tapes and really, look at the crime lab and look at the evidence and, attack it in a systematic way. And you then ask the question, and it's the right question, well, what about all these other people that have no money, that are indigent, that are being represented by court-appointed lawyers for $1,000 a day?
And who cannot afford Henry Lee, too?
And death penalty.
Right? Wait a second, Henry was free.
He was free?
Yeah.
And you guys went in for
Henry was free. And wait a second, what you should realize is that, it goes back to
No, my point is not somebody is the best. So he came the best forensic expert in the country, so considered by many, came free.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you guys came for a limited fee. Not is that well, Barry?
It's Forget that.
Oh, well, forget that,
Meaning that whatever it wasn't enough.
Yeah.
And whatever, and you know, we said this, and whatever it is, there are going to be some people say, my God, they're whores, and there are going to be other people say, how could they do it for so little? You can't win, so just move on.
Okay, you have no reservations about the experience, though.
Oh, sure we have reservations about the
Well,
experience. Who wants to go through an experience like this?
Well, I don't know. I mean,
this is terrible. This was horrible. This was not fun.
You know,
this was the trial of the century, though. This was one of the important. Now, stay with me. No, don't go yet. I got a couple of other things.
Charlie, you know what? Just remember, though, on this other thing
in other words, if you get another call like that, you say no. Even though you at the...
Well, how many more calls are we going to get like this?
Well, okay, but I mean, just want to make sure exactly where you stand. Let me just ask the other question, though. You believe that Judge Ito was pro-prosecution?
Well, I don't think that's really a question. I mean, in this respect, I mean, his rulings were pro-prosecution, and by temperament and instinct, he was pro-prosecution. But, you know, the fact of the matter is, so are a lot of judges. Well, that doesn't mean he's a bad person or he's necessarily unfair, but you have to look at the quality of his rulings, and I think he made some rulings in this case that were very, very troubling.
What was the most troubling ruling?
Well, I think the most troubling ruling has to do with the Furman tapes. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that, you know, you have a tape where a police officer says, my idea of being a police officer is that we're like a posse. Okay. We find the bad guy and we manufacture evidence, and the jury never hears it.
In the United States, the overwhelming majority of judges come out of the ranks of the district attorney's offices. So we're not surprised to find judges who are pro-prosecution. That goes with the territory. But there are other much more
have a prosecutorial mindset, perhaps is a better way of saying it.
Whichever makes you happy. However, there were other much more serious concerns that we both had about Judge Ito and about his demeanor, about whether or not he had the appropriate judicial temperament. I have never seen a judge, for instance, who would bring all the lawyers into chambers before the proceedings one day because he was so smitten with a Jay Leno routine that he had it messengered over so he could show it to the lawyers. I've never seen a judge who would tell jokes about the defendant to the litigants at a sidebar. I've never seen a judge who, you know, who would invite all these celebrities back into chambers from time to time.
Did you have any? Go ahead.
No, and frankly, the most serious question here, and it's one that I think that will have to be investigated by the appropriate entities, is that very early on, right before the trial started, we were concerned about Furman, and we had learned that Furman served in the same station house as Judge Ito's wife. And we thought that the issue about what we could get out of Furman should maybe be sent to a different judge because perhaps it was a conflict. Perhaps it was the kind of conflict which might mean that Judge Ito would have to withdraw from the case. Instead of withdrawing, he procured or secured an affidavit from his wife in which she said that she really had no memory of Mark Furman, okay, or having any dealings with Mark Furman. And once we got the tapes at the end of this case and other discovery toward the very end of the proceedings, very serious questions were raised about the accuracy of that sworn statement procured by Judge Ito from his wife.
His wife was Sergeant York, was that her name?
Captain York.
I don't think he procured it. I think it came about another way. But I think
there's a question about whether or not this affidavit was simply a method for him keeping the case to avoid that kind of conflict situation.
He had a very tough job, and I think that we have to ask some serious questions about whether anyone, given the kind of scrutiny that this case brought to bear, and given the nature of the coverage, because people made up their minds very quickly in this case. The orderly presentation of evidence gets lost when there's so much spin. It's not court TV. Court TV is terrific, but that wasn't the coverage. It was a whole cottage industry up and down that's telling people what to think with sound bites every day, and that begins to affect judgments.
But even Court TV has its failings here. Don't be an apologist for Court TV or Judge Ito. Okay.
Yeah. Good, Peter.
No.
I've got to get to a couple of other points here. Have either of you ever seen a defendant that was more involved, connected, ran his defense
Unfortunately, we've both seen it very frequently.
Oh, really? No, but Simpson took a strong and vital role. Yes?
Most of our clients do. No, seriously. I mean,
Was
that's been
Simpson less than most then?
No, not at all. I mean, maybe there's this a genetic connection. We seek out clients who take an active role in their cases.
I think a lot of defendants are like that. You talk to lawyers in all kinds of cases, and they'll tell you.
So Simpson wasn't any more or less than anybody else. Is that the point?
I think actually what was very impressive about him, though, is that he's a very bright man, and he's a very insightful individual, and he really made a lot of very, very good points during the course of the trial, points that were really common sense. You know, all the smart lawyers there at the table. OJ would always say, ask this question.
That's right. There'd be an OJ question at the end of a cross-examination and was always right on the money. There were
so
times
you grew in admiration for him as this trial continued over the period.
And it wasn't just common sense questions. There would be times we would have to make legal arguments.
All right.
And he would suggest a metaphor or a particular policy position to argue, and he was always right.
Before I go, please tell me what happened between Shapiro and Bailey and Shapiro and Cochran. What was that about?
Well, you know, these are privileged conversations, and this client is not well served by people talking about privileged conversations because it's his privilege. And it's my understanding that he doesn't want people talking about this. And he's quite right about that because it's not good for the process. It's not good for this defendant. When he wants to talk about it in his own way, in his own time, that's fine. But we're not going to be drawn into discussions of things that professionally and ethically we're not supposed to discuss.
I do have to ask this, when the issue has come up beyond what Shapiro had said about the summation and the Hitler reference in the summation.
What about it?
Did you approve of it?
Well, I think that Mr. Cochran himself has said that it probably wasn't the smartest thing to say in terms of the outcry that it has caused. I think that you know, as a Jew, one understands the sensitivity that people have towards any analogy about Hitler or the Holocaust or anything of that nature. And having said that, I still understand in terms of the evidence. I thought it was a fair comment on the evidence. I think it's been much overblown. What he said to the jurors very simply was, people had to know about Mark Fuhrman in this police department, because if he would say the things he said to Catherine Bell in such a casual way, you know he said it to others, you know they were covering up, and you have to have some courage to come forward and say that, and people had to have courage in the face of you know, fascism in the Weimar Republic. That's what the man was saying, and I don't think it's such an outlandish comment.
Did you see it?
Johnny himself, no.
But he was not. No, he never compared Fuhrman with Hitler. That's something that, again, the commentators tried to extrapolate from it. He never made that comparison. All he said was this, that if you allow people who are genocidal racists to fester, to function, and not to be separated, not to be removed from society, and let them exist in positions of power and influence or in law enforcement, that gives rise to fascism. That's what happened with Hitler. No one took a stand. No one tried to stop him. And no one took this guy Fuhrman. You know, people say, well, he's just a racist. People aren't so upset with Mark Fuhrman because he used the N-word. People are upset with Mark Fuhrman because he advocated rounding up all black people and burning them or bombing them. That's something very different than saying, I don't want my white daughter to go out with a black man. Something very, very different. And to have a person like that, who was in favor of planting evidence on black men when they're seen in the company of white women, and is in favor of genocide, if the entire department allows that kind of conduct to go forward and doesn't remove him immediately back in 1982, when they knew about his position, when they knew about his genocidal tendencies, and he wanted out, but instead made him stay in.
About women? I mean, we've seen all the tapes. Not everybody has. You should see what he says about women.
These are audio tapes.
Yeah. You should see what he says about women, what he says about Mexican Americans, what he says about the well, you've heard. He says, let's just bomb the ACLU and the city council. And I mean, there's such a fundamental disrespect. It is not an exaggeration to say that these were fascistic or Nazi views. They were white supremacist views.
I've got to finally ask this question. Knowing that about Fuhrman, having not known about the McKinney tapes, but whatever the prosecution knew about Furman, whatever the police sources they had, did they then face a dilemma with respect to him? We've got no chance of winning this case unless we use him, and so therefore we've got to go in and take our risk. What was their dilemma?
Well, what happened, and this is one of the things that people have to pay careful attention to. There was a district attorney in the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office named Lucian Coleman, a veteran of 16 years, and she says a good friend of Marcia Clark's, who came into the office and talked about this Detective Purdy, who had told her that Furman had, he suspected, been the one that had put a swastika on his locker because he had the temerity to marry a Jewish woman, and had other problems with Furman based on Furman's conduct with other officers in what they called a SPEW unit. Wonderful name. And he actually kept a diary in which he talked about some of these incidents. Lucian Coleman went into Marcia Clark's office and Bill Hodgman's office and said this, and was told by Marcia, at least, you know, I don't want to hear it. Get out of here. Don't hog. I don't want to know about it. Then when she went back to Bill Hodgman did pursue it, and when Lucian Coleman told Detective Purdy, well, they're going to come and take your diary and the things you say about Furman, he threw it in a fireplace by his own admission and burned it, which is tantamount to an obstruction of justice. What is extraordinary here is that all these things were then shunted off to the Internal Affairs Division for investigation, which is like throwing it down a black hole. The investigation of all these Furman incidents. And then when we made a motion under California law, what they call a Pitchess motion, to get all the misconduct, which only goes back 5 years, nothing came out. Now, that's extraordinary. I mean, obviously, there is a systemic problem there in terms of documenting and rooting out this kind of misconduct. That's how Furmans thrive. And that is a systemic problem that has to be dealt with.
Well,
But the point is that they had no, back to my original question, they had no option except to use Mark Furman and take their chances with him, or you're saying...
No. What they could have done, what they could have done and should have done, you know, you talk about a dilemma, it's not a dilemma. You come forward with it. You say the man is a racist, the man is a liar, we're not going to rely on him, we're willing to acknowledge it to the jury from Jump Street.
Right.
And handle your witnesses that way. The problem...
You come in and you say, I've got a flawed
witness. You clean your hands, man. That's exactly what you got to do. Because it's when you don't do it and instead you cover it up, that's when you get burned. What undid Richard Nixon, if Richard Nixon had come forward, was saying these guys in Watergate did a terrible thing, he would have been the president for an extra 4 years. It was the cover-up. And what these prosecutors did with Furman is they tried to cover it up. They tried to make him look like a choir boy. When you go back, if you look at the videotape of Marcia Clark's direct examination and her righteous indignation that Kathleen Bell or anyone else would ever suggest that this man lied or used a naughty or insulting word about black people, you would tear your hair out. It's unbelievable. That's the cover-up. And that's what undid the prosecution here, just as it undid Richard Nixon. I don't think there's any real difference that way. People can tolerate mistakes. People can even tolerate criminal activity, but they can't tolerate a cover-up.
And that's why you ended up with this decision.
Well, that's one of them. You can't lie. You can't put on... I mean, they had Furman lying and then Van Adder lying. On top of all this suspicious conduct and evidence tampering, you've got to have many reasonable doubts. But, you know, it's hard to... It's troubling. I mean, I don't want to believe, and I don't believe, that many of the prosecutors that we deal with on a daily basis, you know, would have turned a blind eye in quite this way. And I think that is another aspect of this case, what Johnny Cochran called the obsession to win. I think it does funny things to people. And, you know, it doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means that you get caught up in something, you develop a strong belief in it, and you make mistakes and misjudgments.
Barry, thank you. Pleasure to have you on this broadcast for the hour. Thank you, Peter.
Right.
Pleasure very much. There are 1,000 more questions, and you've helped, I think, all of us by the exchange and the engagement here, and I thank you very much. I know you'll be watching the Yankees tonight, so will I. One thing, Denise Graves was to be here. She is starring as Carmen at the Metropolitan Opera tomorrow night. Please go. We were going to show that broadcast tonight, but because of this, we ran long. Also, Gus Van Sant has a new film called To Die For, which you should also see. Both of those conversations will take place next week. I thank you for joining us on this Friday. We look forward to seeing you on Monday. See you then.